So now let's take a look at the query capabilities of the server query. You'll see I have the server query open. I've got the R4 Happy R4 server selected. Previously we were looking at the server capabilities. Now we'll take a look at the query tab. And as you can see, the query tab has got a number of sub-tabs. The query builder, which allows us to build a query by selecting from UI components, and we'll see this in just a minute. The ad hoc REST query, which lets you just enter in a query of any sort to be executed against the server. The history records the queries that we create over time, and we can re-execute them if we wish to. And finally, there is a query help tab here. We're going to start by looking at the query builder, and in fact we're going to start by creating some sample data, and we'll do that by going back up to clinFHIR, selecting the patient viewer, ensuring that our data server is set correctly here to Happy4. Go into patient viewer. For those who aren't familiar, patient viewer is an app which lets us view data from a FHIR server about a patient. And we'd select a patient here like so. Generally we could look up now the patient on that server using their name and ID or identifier, but we also have this ability to add a new patient, and this is the one that we're going to do. And notice that the generate samples checkbox is set. So if I click on add patient now, it'll go ahead and it will make up a set of sample data. It's a fixed set of sample data for a random patient, and we are going to collect a few of these IDs. First off, we're going to select the patient ID, which I'll make a note of, and then we'll go in and we'll look at the data. Click on the close button here, and here we now see the information which has been created for this patient and subsequently collected. We won't go through this in detail, but what we will do is we'll go to one of the conditions, let's call it depression, and we'll pull out the ID for that as well. The easiest way is just to pull it out like so, and we'll make a note of that one as well. Right, so now that we've done that and we've created some sample data, then let's go and take a look at it through the server query. So again, I come in here, I make sure that I am set to the same server, and I'll start by just doing a simple query. Now in the query builder tab, you'll see on this left hand side here we have types, and there's actually two lists of types. The first one here are the ones that we've actually been using on this browser. It's stored in the browser session, and that's a convenience because it makes it easier to go back to a particular resource type. And then underneath it is a list of all the types supported by this server, again from the capability statement. We're going to go to the patient, and notice how when we select the type on the left hand side we get details here in the middle. These are all the parameters for this patient, again from the capability statement. And let's keep it simple. Let's say I want to have patients whose name, I click on the name to select it. Hey, notice how the URL is being created above, and let's click on execute, and that will then execute that query against the server. Phew. And it will then return a set of results. So there are 26 entries. There is the query that was executed. We can select on any one of these entries like so, and we can see the details either as a JSON view, an XML view, a tree-like view, and there's also a graph view. Now the graph is actually really for the bundle as a whole, and at the moment, as you can see, it only consists of patient resources and nothing connecting them, which is what we would expect. If we wish, we can show the whole bundle like so, clicking that icon, and we now see the bundle as a JSON thing there. So let's close this and do something just a little bit more interesting. Notice how over on the side here we also have the ability to specify includes and chaining. Now includes is a mechanism by which you can cause a single query to include resources that are referenced by your target resource. So for example, if I have a patient Then I could say that here's a query on patient and here are the parameters for patient, name equals hey in this case, and could you please include the general practitioner link. So if this patient has got a reference to a general practitioner resource, then that would be included in our bundle. But what we will do is we will do this against our sample data, and for this we needed to have the condition ID. So what we're going to do is we are going to go to a condition. I haven't used condition yet, so I'll find it in the list down here. There it is. Now you'll remember I very carefully took a copy of the ID for this condition, and this is the reason why I did it. So what I can now do is I can now say that I want to find a condition where the ID of that condition is this one here. Now this is a search, so I'm going to get a bundle coming back. But I'll also say that as well as returning this resource, and even though it's a bundle there should only be one, could you also please include any referenced encounters, patient or subject. And again, these are from the capability statement for this resource. Now if I execute that statement, we will now see that I get two resources coming back and they are different. So there is my patient, and there's my patient with the ID that I entered, but I've also, and there is the condition. I'm sorry, there's the condition with the condition ID that I entered, and there is the patient who this condition is about, and we can see that in the graph view. So we can now see the condition that I searched for and the patient to which this condition applies. And had there been any encounters that reference this condition, then I would expect to see them as well. But what this lets you do is it lets you create that sample data and then just have a play with it on the server. I'll close that. Now chaining queries are a very useful way of extracting data, because a chained query allows you to search for a particular or on a particular resource type, but looking for but the query is on resources which that type references. Now this will all make a lot more sense in the context of an example. So let's assume that we want to find all of the condition resources for a given patient. So we can do that as follows. We can say that we want a condition, and then over under the patient side here we're going to do a chain. We'll put a patient, and we'll say that the ID is going to equal the ID that I copied from the previous example. So if I execute this query, it's going to fail. So I'm just saying this up front, and I'll explain why in a second. So I click on execute and we get an error back, and we can see the error, and the error was that the parameter chain patient.id wasn't valid. The reason why it's invalid is that you need to use underscore ID in a query. So if we now execute that query, we will now get the 11 conditions that belong to this patient. But it would be kind of nice to get the patient as well. That's easy. We go back here and we say that we want the patient. And I will now re-click. So now I have 12 entries, and we see that somewhere in here should be a patient. There it is, down the bottom there. And so we can look at that patient. We can see the details as we did before. But now the graph is a bit more useful, because the graph now shows the references between the resources that we have applied. I close results to go back to here. So that's really the way that the query builder works. I encourage you to experiment and see how it works out. It will always show you the query here which it is executing. This query could be entered into any RESTful client and this would work. So the other tabs on the query side of things are the ad hoc REST query, and again you can just type in any query that you want. Notice how it brings across the query from the query builder. So that means that you can build a query as far as you can go in the query builder and then modify it manually in the ad hoc REST query, because not all the capabilities of a FHIR server search are currently supported by query builder. That's a work in progress. As we said before, we have the history, which lets us look at previous queries and re-execute them, and finally the help. So that is the query capabilities of server query.